We can perhaps get started. So, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Reuters Events webinar. The topic we'll be discussing today is fulfilling real-world evidence's potential to ensure reliable, diverse, and decentralized data sources. I'm Ram Ramagoplan, and I'm going to be the moderator for this webinar today. And today we've got an esteemed panel of speakers, starting from Kelly Zhou from Viatris, Simon Dagenet from Pfizer, Mendel Haag from CSL, and Victoria Gammerman from Boehringer Ingelheim. I just want to put a disclaimer out there that the views that people are talking about today are not necessarily the views of their company, but we're looking forward to a really good discussion, and we're opening up for questions. So please do put questions on the chat, which I will pass over to the panelists. Now, there's multiple different areas that we want to talk about and discuss today. And the first one, I guess, I'm really interested in now that we've had an EMA publication this week about data quality and data provenance, but just wanted to kind of open up to the panelists and maybe starting off with Kelly, just to talk about briefly her thoughts on how we as a community can implement patient and provider data quality and assurance measures to ensure that real-world data is accurate and reliable. Kelly, would you like to open up for us?
Yeah, thank you, Sriram, and welcome, audience. It's a great pleasure to be with our panelists. A little bit about myself. I'm Kelly Zhou, head of Global Medical Analytics and Real World Evidence at Viatris. Viatris was formed after a merger between a division at Pfizer and also with Mylan to form Viatris about 3 years ago. So that has been a great journey. Sriram, you asked about sort of data quality. I would say, first of all, this is a very complex topic. Depending on where you look at, back in June, I was fortunate to give some industry perspectives to the European medicines agencies, essentially just to talk about what we understand about the aspect of quality. I would say, first of all, this is, it depends on your purpose. The quality can come up in terms of different degrees of, importance, right? If by nature, real world evidence or from real world data, sometimes that's really big data, itself can be really messy to begin with, how much quality you want to control, because that's not going to be the same as randomized control trials where the standard of evidence is high. But the flip side is that you may end up having, data that may not be representative, that may not be really covering the patient population of interest. So I would say, in terms of various dimensions, you're welcome to look at the European aspects of the various dimensions to measure. But I would say, since we have a very broad spectrum of audience, depending on where you are, for example, even US alone, the Sentinel, PCORNet, FDA, they have various different dimensions. I just want to throw some of those, concepts. For example, completeness, consistency, accuracy, persistence, and also conformance, all these terminologies. I would say the European version really talks about how those dimensions and also sub-dimensions were elicited. So it's a lot of work. And then I would say these dimensions will capture different angles of data quality, but overall, it's a very complex topic.
And maybe I can just add, I think we can also consider examples where internally within organizations, without thinking about some of these other things to contextualize it. I really like, Kelly, what you said about it depends on purpose. And we often think about the terminology of fit for purpose data. So take an example where you might have a data set or a data asset that has things like emails of, let's say, HCPs or organizations or customers, whoever is the customer of interest. And you might also have addresses, you might have other different kinds of information, some data about that customer or those customers. And if your purpose is to be able to segment them, for example, right, identify clusters based on certain demographics, you would not really care that emails, for example, is a field that is populated for only 20%, because it's not a field of interest relative to the problem that you're trying to solve. It's not fit for that purpose. But if you are, say, from a different part of an organization and you're trying to leverage that data asset and you need to send out a marketing campaign, right, then for you, the fact that there's only 20% of data available would raise questions of what kind of biases might exist for those 20% that are available and 80% that are not available, or what else does it mean that we have this limited information? What other questions should we be asking? So I really liked, Kelly, the fit for purpose concept that you also raised.
Yeah, and I think I can reiterate that as well. You know, in the field of my company is involved in the development of influenza vaccines, CSL Seqirus, and my group conducts the real world evidence for the purposes of showing really the value of that our technology and of influenza vaccination as a whole. But when we do our real world evidence, it's you know, we have to balance perfect data with, for example, sample size. If we don't have enough sample size, but we have perfect data in a very small subpopulation or a very small data set, we cannot answer our research questions. So we always have to balance quality with, you know, what is the level that we find acceptable to be able to draw conclusions from our research. And so, as you were saying, there's multiple dimensions, but the balance that we have to make also depends on, you know, what's our alternative for generating this evidence.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far. There isn't a one-size-fits-all quality. It depends what you're trying to do with the data, depends the question, depends on the audience. And speaking of alternatives, we can think of real-world data as being messy and imperfect, and we can think about a data set, you know, not having this variable for 100% of people. Therefore, we view it as somehow flawed. But let's remember some of the alternatives, especially for internal decision making. The alternative to analyzing a real-world data set might be market research. So there's a decision that needs to be made, and there's a certain timeline when it needs to be made. And if they don't use data to answer it, they'll sort of make their own data by calling 12 expert, you know, key opinion leaders and taking the average of the 12, and boom, there's your number. So yes, real world data is imperfect, but I think when we look at the alternatives, maybe a database with, you know, 100 million individuals and healthcare data over several years has some value to it compared to some of these alternatives.
Yeah, I think we can also draw the analogy to randomized clinical trials, right, which we consider the highest quality standard of evidence. But then, you know, particularly if I think about our space with influenza vaccine research, we deal with varying viruses year in, year out. And that seasonal variability, you can't capture that in a clinical trial that may run, you know, maybe over a few seasons, because the next season will be different again. And so real world evidence really provides that continuity of the evidence over multiple years. So yes, very high quality standards in RCTs, but then real world evidence brings that additional perspective and the longitudinality of that evidence across multiple seasons under different conditions, different viruses that are circulating. So I would agree with what was just said.
Really good discussion. And Mendel, just to push you on your use case situation. So in my experience, the toughest bar seems to be for treatment effectiveness. So when you're trying to use real world evidence to prove to some stakeholder that drug X delivers this. Whereas Simon, I think, was maybe touching on internal decision making, where you don't need that bar of evidence. In terms of that bar, Medal, in terms of that, a lot of pushback, and I work in the HTA kind of environment. For example, in Germany, they always say real world data, the quality is never good enough, no matter what you do, even if you build a fit for purpose registry. Do you think there's an element that people aren't being pragmatic enough, or are they acceptably concerned given the issues with the messiness of real world data?
Yeah, so you raise a very good example. So one of the topics of debate has been around using clinical diagnosis for infectious disease, where we can tell from an electronic medical records that a patient was hospitalized, for example, for influenza, but the record doesn't actually hold that influenza test confirmation, maybe because it gets documented elsewhere in the hospital and never makes its way into the medical record of the patient. But then on the other hand, we do know that hospitals have policies in place to test patients who come in with respiratory disease, particularly during high activity of influenza. And so, do we really, with, maybe some level of misclassification, do we really, can we not accept this outcome in a hospital setting for a clinical diagnosis of flu? And, we can even limit to high periods of influenza activities to investigate some of that biases. Do we see an extent of misclassification? But in absence, particularly lab confirmation is a type of data that not always makes its way through to the electronic health records. I think we do need to then look at, clinical diagnosis. Can we rely on that? What can we investigate to assure that this actually represents those cases of influenza by looking, for example, at the surveillance data, and how does that match with your incidence of the outcome in your data set? So really, there are techniques to look at, the extent of misclassification that we can apply to assure that we're actually looking at good quality outcomes. So
maybe also to add a little bit there, I think there's a lot of what, in addition, Simon, to what you had mentioned, and this distinction of for what part in the decision making does the evidence that gets generated get used, right? And this distinction around that you drew between some of the types of places where the decisions are different. There's also an element, I think, that Mandel, you just touched on, which is this idea around how do we sort of define what is it that we want to capture, whether it's captured from existing things or we have to bring together multiple sources and across maybe different and disparate parts of the data ecosystem in order to really be able to address the question with supplemental, complementary information. And I think there's an element from the view of those who design the research questions to also consider where does the data that we need come from, and how do we define or design even that data product, to use the modern terminology, to in almost a very user customer centric way, so that if a regulator is in Germany, right, is our target audience for the HTA conversation, how do we understand what is that threshold, and what would be if we dig deeper and deeper and ask the why and the why and the why further, where we can really get at, this is the level of threshold that they may be comfortable with. And I think same goes with also internal executives who are looking to make those kind of business decisions, where there may be, again, different care should be taken in how we translate the data that ultimately can be provided, because some things exist, some things are available, and some may need to really be pulled together from across different places. So I think that's a very interesting point you brought up.
Yeah, maybe to build on that, I think it's also, the way that we actually assess that quality of data, there are certain, standards for that, for example, grade evaluation, but also those ways that we assess it might be indication specific. Again, and I come from the space of influenza, but if you talk about vaccines, elements of grade that could actually raise the quality of evidence are dose response relationship, or bias always being in one direction. Well, if I can tell one thing, the bias in vaccine research never works in one direction. So it's very, and that dose response relationship, or what is a high effect in influenza, 10% relative vaccine effectiveness can make a big difference on a population level. So So really, you know, those techniques that we use to assess quality of evidence, sometimes they don't work across all of the indication areas. And so we have to view that in the context of the indication area probably that we are working in.
Well, I also, yeah, excuse me. Go ahead, Simon.
No,
I just want to add that, you know, because I was also reading some of the questions and responded a few questions, is that generally there is a really difference in terms of data availability and also the siloed, you know, nature of the data across different geographical regions. For example, you know, in Nordic countries, you know, registries are fairly well known, and that inherently tend to have, you know, really good quality. However, the limitation for the biopharmaceutical, you know, industry's usage is that we also want to know how the medications are being used, you know, so how the linkage of data will be giving you this breadth of data, not just say the depth of the data. So that's the other aspect. And then if you think about the US, you know, we have many specialized, you know, data sources, because we were talking about vaccines, we were talking about, you know, other purposes, but from vaccines to oncology to rare disease to other chronic diseases, these are sort of different data sources. And then from the patient equity aspects, you know, from elderlies to, you know, long-term care to, you know, patients in specialized settings. So these are all somehow the data are in bits and pieces. So when you think about this data quality, how much you drill down to the vertical sort of quality versus you also want to look at the comprehensiveness of the data to really get the informed, you know, picture about patients and their journey. So I think that's also challenging. Of course, for regulatory purposes, the quality is usually inherently high, but in order to do sort of understanding of patient journey, patient voice, you know, Victoria talked about sort of data sources that are not in the traditional sort of claims or EMRs like social media and so on. So how would you think about this messiness of data, but balancing with understanding patients?
The example that came to mind for the balancing act with quality is looking at body weight in an electronic health record. So if you're looking for weight gain or weight loss, you need serial body weight measurements. And if you've ever looked in EMR data, you'll notice that there's plenty of data on body weight, but it does not conform to whatever rules you may have going into it. And so you may think, oh, it's bad quality data. You know, how can this person weigh this much? That number is implausible. So then you start trimming the extreme values. And then you start looking at changes over time. And if there's an extreme change from one visit to the next, you make another rule and you trim extreme changes. And then you slowly start to trim and trim and trim. They're all logical. You can defend them. But in the end, have you really improved the quality of the underlying data? Or have you just turned a blind eye to it and chosen to make your life easier by applying all of these rules? You know, let's say someone in one visit is recorded as weighing 230 pounds. The next visit, 2 weeks later, it's 100 pounds. Probably impossible. What happened? Did they mistakenly enter in kilos when they meant pounds? Okay, from 230 to 220, is that plausible? Sure. Do I make that change because it's a reasonable assumption? If I do that, have I improved the quality of the data? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, you know, Simon, the principle there that comes to mind is, you know, to what extent can we make the data in these disparate sources fair by design, or think about a common data model where some of these things across different real world data sources are somehow aligned to some common metrics, right? Some common units, so that there is, for the purposes of research, which is not what some of these systems are designed for, going back to the fit for purpose principle, but what can we do? And I think most of the audience is probably familiar with FAIR, but for those who it might be a new concept, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so this idea that we that there can be data elements, right, that can be by design with that intentionality that it would be used for research, to be thoughtful, to have maybe edit checks in some of these systems that say, hey, there's this drastic change from the last entry, right, that you entered, flag, is that quite right? Something that helps to really knowing the opportunity that exists to be able to understand human health when we have strong phenotypic information on people, and the opportunity to really then increase the quality grade research of that. I think there's a huge piece there that is missing, which is that these systems at the moment are really not fair by design.
Thanks, Victoria and Simon. I just want to follow up on your last 2 points, really, and that's broadly another topic we're tasked with, which is to think about identifying and minimizing bias and addressing confounding in data sets. And how have you thought about any frameworks, seen any frameworks? There's been a lot in the literature over the last 5 years. Anything that you think comes to mind and should be seen as best practice that can give stakeholders confidence and trust in the data that we're providing them?
Yeah, I think the FDA introduced its framework for RWE, and in that they leaned heavily on best practices for pharmacoepidemiology research, which itself leaned heavily on best practices from ISPE, from ISPOR, from NCEP. So the principles have been around for a long time, which is you make sure you have a clear research question, you make sure it's stated a priori, you make sure your population that you apply the question to is the intended population, that you can extrapolate from that, and then you sequentially try to apply criteria in a way that gets you closer to the population you want, and you try to mitigate for all of the biases that you can identify ahead of time, knowing that the ultimate bias of lack of randomization, say, is a tough one. So I think it's about being very thoughtful and transparent. And if you're testing the efficacy or the safety of a product for a regulator, I think there's a much more scrutiny than if you're doing something to answer an internal question. But I think the principles still hold. Some of the internal questions that you're trying to answer have pretty large consequences, and you should be able to explain to people what methods you took to make sure that the number you come up with, which is often reduced to a single point estimate of, that's what people want to know. When you give that number, you have to put it in a context that lays out its limitations. But there's no magic formula. I think it's just being methodical.
Well, I just want to provide some thought in terms of, first aspect. If you read quite a lot on a sort of broader spectrum about sort of artificial intelligence, and then a lot of that relies on sort of real world data sources. There are many discussions about sort of potential biases that we could see, right? For example, really the sort of right population, sort of the right patients, and the kind of aspect of patient diversity, patient equity in, also clinical trials. And also, measuring the right thing, and then I think my last thought is that it's quite often ignored in terms of the mechanism of missing data. So patients come and some fields may be missing, or sometimes some visits, patients will skip some missing. And when we usually see that kind of a missing data, we just say, oh, this is big data, because after all, we can still see the remainder of the patterns. But as a statistician by training, you really need to look at the mechanism. Did those data were missing randomly or missing really due to certain reasons? And one of the reasons is really could be access, could be social determinants of health. Sometimes the transportation, sometimes accessing to the clinics, that's just not very easy. And then perhaps you have innovative digital solutions like telehealth and so on. So I think, in terms of big data, you can see those kind of a potential kinds of outliers, missing data. But if you dig deeper, you might find a solution that could really be helping the patients.
Yeah, and you talked previously about, how do you go about in classifying BMI, for example. I think, when we enter in this type of research to publish your findings in terms of what happened when you varied the definition for a certain exposure or a variable in your model, and what was your finding? Did it or did not, did your analysis remain robust when you actually varied that by a certain degree? And conducting sensitivity analysis to really investigate what was the extent that any remaining residual bias would have affected my findings, or could have affected my findings, and publishing that so that future research can actually benefit from the insights that were gained from prior research. Also contextualizing your evidence. I mean, again, in flu, we gain a lot by looking at, the different research that has been conducted over time. And sometimes we can expect differences because of the seasonal characteristics. And in other times we expect similar differences between vaccines, for example, because of those seasonal characteristics. And that contextualization of the data and that consistency of the data and looking across different pieces of evidence, I think is highly informative for understanding where does bias still play a role or not, perhaps, in the way that we've conducted our research.
I'm so glad you mentioned sensitivity analyses. I fret over two things in the analyses I do. One is the patient flow. I fret over every single step. Does it make sense? Why am I losing X percent of the population? Yeah. What does it mean that I'm losing X percent of the population? Am I comfortable applying this, knowing how it limits external validity? And then once I'm okay with the patient flow, I then do a lot of sensitivity analyses with body weight, for example. One very negative way to look at it is, well, if any single value in this data set with 100 million values says that someone weighs 1,500 pounds, then obviously that's wrong, and therefore this is a bad data set. But if you come up with all of your rules to exclude biologically implausible data, and you see that it only affects 0.03% of the population, then you know that even though those individual values looked questionable, they have minimal impact on whatever conclusions you want to draw from this. So I think that's really important. And sometimes I just try to come up with a lot of different ways to question myself. And then I do sensitivity and I show, okay, it makes no difference, but my curiosity is satisfied.
Yeah.
This to me is a great example of the importance of having that critical thinking applied and to the question of how do we reduce bias and what frameworks are there to reduce bias. In addition to the analytical techniques, it's also an approach, I think, a way of thinking and working that researchers in this space have or maybe teams should have in terms of skill set. So I think there's a huge opportunity to do that kind of scientific method, scientific critical thinking, and really apply to test even your own hypotheses and ideas. So I really appreciate that example, Simon.
I also want to mention that, we often, see our process as evidence generation, but actually the first layer is data generation. So for example, there's a lot of discussion about certifying the data generation system, right? Usually make sure that these are well calibrated and these are easy to use. Sometimes when it gets to be too complicated, it's a deterrence of patients who have trouble interacting with some of those systems, as you know. And I think, as sort of researchers, we always need to really understand how data were generated, were captured, were transferred, what kind of data privacy regulations that will be governing that. And also making sure where data are being stored and who's processing the data. So these are a lot of these data engineering aspects of the questions associated with the quality aspect of the data as well.
Thanks all. And just moving a little bit to the next topic, and coming back to the point you mentioned, Victoria, just in terms of data sets, we all know or have instances of we want a specific variable and it's not available in the data set that we're using or interested in, and or there's data we want on certain patient groups and that data set is also not available. Victoria, any thoughts on in terms of partnering with stakeholders, patient groups, physician groups, to get better access to data and or creating new data sets?
It is such a difficult, I think, question because it really depends on the purpose. So I can't say there's a golden rule, right, or a one size fits all. But I think depending on where, for example, the solution that we're working on for the patients is in the life cycle, depending on the type of solution. To Kelly's point, there could be different ways that we could assess and collect that data or new things that could be turned on once we look at the landscape. So the first part is really understanding the problem from my perspective and really thinking about the why that gap exists, right? And if there's a systematic opportunity that holistically could be addressed, that presents the biggest potential win. Things that have been successful that I've observed in the environment are also then creating things like patient registries where there is a specific maybe diagnosis or disease registry, right, depending on the condition to be studied. In cases of rare disease, for example, right, there's a lot of times, to Kelly's point around being able to start from the perspective not just of generating the evidence, but generating the data. If it's a rare condition, maybe the unique aspects of that disease are not captured in some standard EMRs, right? And so how do you then really go in and in a patient-centric way and in a way that doesn't also add burden to the sites and those treating and seeing and helping the patients? How do you actually get at what really can be helpful and collect that right additive information? And then I think to do that really with its most impact, how is that fit for purpose? So knowing already upfront, for example, what is it that is the problem that we're trying to solve can be very helpful. And it could be a lot, for example, around understanding that patient journey and understanding their path to, for example, diagnosis or post-diagnosis, their path towards treatment. So creating fit for purpose patient registries, I think, is one of the tools that can be used. But most importantly, I would say understanding the problem and why that gap in the data exists could really holistically come up, create opportunities and identify opportunities for how that can be solved for more than just that one point in time, which a registry may often do.
Yeah, Victoria, I think really understanding the needs of our stakeholders in terms of the data that they would like to see in order to make informed decisions on their end is very important. I think even, in the context of vaccines, the National Technical Immunization Advisory Groups are important stakeholders for us. It's not only the regulatory hurdle that we need to pass, we also need to have a dialogue with these NITAGs in short, to really discuss about the benefit and the value that new technologies bring, and what is the evidence that is acceptable to them to really build their decisions on. And I think they can even help us with this dialogue of unlocking some of the data that we need for our research. In the space of, the laboratory confirmation, surveillance data, or vaccine exposure data, for example, that might actually be captured in other data sources than your routine electronic health records. And in absence of that perfect data, again, where we started our discussion today, in absence of that perfect data, right, can we work with them to what's acceptable? What type of sensitivity analysis do we do to investigate potential risk of misclassification, such that that data is believable to them in order to build their decision making?
I think, Ron, there are some data vendors who are trying to help with that next step. I think traditionally, real world data has been somewhat of a black box where you license it from a vendor, but as a condition of licensing it, the vendor can't tell you where the data comes from, and you can't try to re-identify it. So if you have any questions about the data, it's sort of, too bad. But I think that's changing. I'm thinking of a company like Trinetics, which has relationships with healthcare organizations where you know where the data is coming from. Maybe not at an individual patient level, but you know which healthcare organizations are contributing. And Trinetics will act as an intermediary if you need to contact one of those organizations to see if they are interested in doing something like enhancing the data that's already collected. So at least there's a possibility of doing that. Yeah. There's another company, Truveta, that is formed by healthcare organizations with the same idea. You do your analysis, but when you find something that isn't quite what you want, you have the ability to go back to the healthcare organizations and see, based on their patient volumes, you already know that they have the patients you're interested in. Now it's a matter of what would it take to go out and collect missing data X. So at least there's some traceability. It's not perfect, and it's these are still fairly new, but I think it's a lot better than it was when you just couldn't answer any questions around, can I go back to the source and ask them to do this? The answer was always no.
Yeah. You mentioned, really having a good understanding of that origin of the data, where it really comes from. I think that also helps when you think about race, for example. That is not often, there's a lot of missing data for race. But when you have a good understanding of where your data comes from, then you can understand, is that generalizable? Am I only dealing with patients with very good health coverage, for example? Or is this more representative of the whole of the population? So understanding that origin, describing the data set in which you've done your research, again, naming the example of when you know that this data comes from a hospital and you know the policies in hospitals are generally to test for influenza, can we rely on those diagnoses actually representing true cases of the disease you're actually interested in? So yes, origin of the data, understanding where it comes from. Size also plays a role, right? How big is your sample size relative to the overall population of a country as well?
Well, I also want to add that, Simon, when you were just talking about sort of not knowing how data were exactly all the details of data, in my mind, I was also thinking of the sort of in a joking way, double-blind situation, because the data source providers, they really want to know how you're going to use the data, what kind of a hypothesis you want to test. And not always it's testing hypothesis. It could be hypothesis generating. But at the same time, for practitioners, the sponsors, without knowing the data, you cannot define the problem. So it's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg, sort of, I would say a bit of a, in a joking way, double-blind situation. So I think really knowing the language, I think that also the understanding of the tech side versus understanding of the medical side or healthcare side, I think that's really important. I think sometimes the miscommunication could also be really, how do you solve the quality on your end, or do I solve the quality on my end? So that's the other aspect. I also want to note that, right now, as you know, this year, there was the final guidance of the external control arms. FDA sort of issued that guidance back in February. So I think this has been existing for a long time, but it was always a bit of a silo. When I'm looking at some of the questions being raised, we're talking about evidence for payer purposes, evidence for understanding disease burden, evidence in terms of really post-marketing, safety surveillance. But nowadays, there's a lot of earlier use of evidence in the optimized design of clinical trials. And sometimes in terms of particular applications, oncology, rare disease, you can think about what are some ethical considerations. And I think the topic of ethics is really important in terms of the data sphere, and really understand that can you really design some studies where there could be external control arms, historical control, concurrent control. So that is where, how would you match that kind of a patient characteristics as if you had real patients collecting data, which may or may not be possible. In a way, is that aspect of the quality or really representativeness would be really important.
Kelly, I've often asked myself a similar question around what is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to improve the quality of the data as we see it? Or are we trying to improve the quality of the data being collected? And it's often not clear which of the two it is, because we don't know if the data was collected correctly and it just didn't make its way to us. Sometimes with EMR data, for example, they won't turn over the unstructured notes because of the risk of re-identifying someone. So they summarize it and all you get is the summary. And so you don't know if the data you're interested in is available, but you didn't get it, or if it just wasn't collected in the first place. And sometimes when you're able to lift that veil and look at the unstructured data, you realize, well, the data wasn't collected in the first place. And that becomes a harder thing to fix. So an example I'm thinking of is in migraine research or headache research, the number of headache days per month is very important. That's often a metric. It's used to classify you, as a patient, and it can be used to access certain therapies. So you would think that key metric would be captured in every single visit, or at least return visit related to migraine. But that's not the case. So it's not an issue of data quality that's fixable once the data has been collected. This is something that would need to be addressed by bringing it up to providers and saying, this particular variable is really important to all these people. Could you do something to collect it more often? And that you need partners for.
Yeah. And another example I know in the UK, for example, a pharmacist, actually, they provide their data, but then they also get reports back in terms of how are they doing on their influenza coverage. So they actually have an interest to do very well on their recording of their coverage. I think, with the the vast data sets that we're dealing in the US, there's often not a link between the actual origin of the data and the data custodian that makes the data available for research. But I agree, once that link is there, you can actually expand your ability to maybe at the start, at the where the data gets recorded by the healthcare professional, perhaps improve that by including prompts, or create incentives by which they will actually have a higher, their incentive will be to create more quality, higher level standards of information.
There's that piece, and I think there's also the piece of the technology, right? So the technology has to exist in a way that we're able to ask the question and that there's a place to enter that information in the hopes that it's beyond the unstructured notes and that it's actually systematically therefore captured. And I think this is where the technology partners, those who provide the systems that the clinicians, the hospitals, the systems use, can be a bit more have more of a value proposition, I guess, right, to what you're saying. What is the value to them and how do they know? And maybe it's an element of tracing, right, the funding and the finances. And if that, particular EMR would get used more, it has higher quality research grade data that then can be used by researchers to get more insights. There should be that kind of incentive and value proposition. And I really liked what you said, Mendel, about the metrics back, because the HCP certainly are the ones entering the data, but if there's no space or no prompt to be a visual reminder to enter, return migraine days over the past month, or average over the past 6 months, or whatever it is. And so that reminds me of some of the research that is also ongoing at the moment in terms of ontologies and knowledge graphs, and a lot of these things that allow us to come to a common understanding around what are these concepts that even we're trying to measure. How do we define, for example, for patients who have a particular disease like migraines, what is it that constitutes a complete migraine visit or a complete return visit for a particular condition? And so I think there's so many opportunities to systematically address those points. But there needs to be also the value proposition and that feedback loop around the incentive to be able to really increase the quality there. And again, so that it's fair by design, so that it is fit for purpose at the very origin of the data creation. So really excellent point.
I also want to emphasize the aspect of patient-centric, aspect is that, as you know, in terms of clinical trials, nowadays, some of these sponsors, they return the data to the patients who, that patients really know what they did and how they were measured. And I think that's really important to have that encouragement, feedback, and on the other hand, it's always, another option for patients to opt out. There are various reasons they might, do so. They might opt out. They might drop out. Maybe that's not sort of ideal situation from the data practitioner's point of view. But if you are ever a patient, as all of us have been, you have your reasons, So I think understanding the patients, not just say in terms of the machine, how data are being collected. Healthcare is really dealing with, people. So how would you think about this human-centric way of understanding, their needs, understanding how they interact with the system? What are some pain points? That would be really useful to also help you understand the gaps in terms of data aspects like quality.
Thanks all. We're coming up to the end of the webinar. So just one more topic I want to cover, and you've kind of briefly touched on it, all of you. Kelly, you mentioned about linkage, and Simon, Victoria, Mendel, you mentioned about data already being there. I think one of the issues is that we have data sets that don't essentially talk to each other. They're not interoperable. I know some of you have been involved in Odyssey and other initiatives. Where do you see that going in terms of interoperability of data sets and kind of bringing data together so we can answer better, bigger and better research questions? Kelly, perhaps you could take that.
Yeah, quickly. It happens to, I also am looking at the questions, one of the questions about, common data model, data standardization. If you look in, I was just about to, respond that if you look into the European health data space, so this is spelled out, very much in terms of emphasis. The reason is not only having the standard formats will be really, really important. For example, formats like CDISC format, here we're talking about OMAP, we're talking about some of those, common data models. But I think in order for data to be comparable, so that's really useful way. And also, for example, European side, they're looking at metadata catalog. So you can search for the data, discover the data more easily. And I think one thing standardization will give us easier way of being able to understand different elements, understanding, how you can, from data source A to B, how comparable they are, how complementary they are. On the other side, when you have the standardization, you may also lose the original intuition. So really understanding, what these variables really mean as the traditional data dictionary. So I would say, it's kind of two sides. It has the really great usage, but also has, sometimes the becoming sort of a more of a scientific exercise rather than understanding the original, interpretation of the data elements.
You lose some, you win some. Yes, I would agree. I mean, there's a trade-off there. I think one of the key advantages of standardization is perhaps to enable really that interoperability that comes with the potential to create richer data by merging certain data sets, but also potentially larger sample sizes, because it allows you to put actually data sets together, and particularly where you have countries with smaller populations, and you need to expand that. I think you mentioned, great databases, and we've collaborated as CSL Seqirus also with investigators in Finland, for example. They have tremendously rich data, and that captures a population, but the reality is that the Finnish population is not that big. And so, how can we increase those sample sizes? Can we look at actually doing research across different data sources? And data standardization can help with that, and it can help to enrich the data.
And maybe adding to that point, I think with the ability to enrich or standardize or increase the sample size, as the number of that sample gets larger, you also then have the opportunity to really be able to leverage novel analytical methods that don't apply or don't have those insights that they can generate off of smaller sample sizes, but off of large sample sizes could generate hypotheses that, ideas or insights that we could identify and see when you have that interoperable, large, diverse, sometimes messy data set to find these bits and pieces of very interesting, novel findings. There's researchers who do a lot of exploration on Twitter data, right? That I would say is also a very messy, real world space. And yet some of the unique things that we might not expect to be connected actually do generate certain interesting novel findings. So again, the critical thinking is really important there when you think about, to Kelly's point, some of the information that may be lost when you implement standardization, but some of the value that you get from being able to apply some novel machine learning, deep learning techniques to these very large, rich and diverse data sets to generate new ideas, or to really further assess some of the ideas that researchers have, could be very much a value adding.
A different take on interoperability in the US is tokenization. So some people feel that arguing for one data standard for all sources may be difficult. So the alternative is, as long as everyone uses a patient identifier that is common across data sources, then at least we can find the same patient across data sources. It's okay that different data sources are in different formats, as long as we can link them at the patient level. So I've had to try to explain this internally, and talk even about the possibility of tokenizing clinical trial participants to be able to capture data from outside the clinical trial after the follow-up ends. So that's an alternative. If standardization cannot occur at the data formatting level, then at least tokenization or some method of linking patients gets us a bit closer.
Thanks all. I think this is the final wrap up of this very interesting webinar. So we've had a lot of work thinking about quality. So we've got quality frameworks, we've got better data sources available, we've got analytical technologies such as AI, natural language processing, to make those data sources better. So it'd be good to get from all of you, where do you think the current state of play is in terms of real-world data quality and acceptability? And where do you think we will be in 5 to 10 years? And what do we need to get to improvements in that, if you think improvements are currently needed? And maybe I'll start with Mendel and then go through the rest of the panelists.
Yeah, so I think the direction and the pace of the technology will probably much rely or depend on the acceptability of those new developments with our stakeholders, so those that actually use that data for their decision making. Within the space of influenza, real-world evidence is really viewed as critically important by a lot of the national immunization technical advisory groups, but that acceptance is not universal. So I think the discussion that we had here today, how can we demonstrate the robustness and the complementary value of real-world evidence in addition to RCTs, is really an ongoing dialogue. And I still see a lot of our conversation being around that, alongside technological advancements and collaborating across different partners. We're really interested in CSL Seqirus to work with partners who hold data that we so much need to be able to do our research. Yeah, that's what I would leave you with as a last final thought.
And my thought is that it's still kind of a quality. It's still a complex topic. Bring awareness is the first step, and how to execute. And, some of those questions being raised, how we standardize, how we, have the catalog, what are we going to do with, outliers? These still the rule-based sort of discussions need to have some contexts, I would say.
Maybe from my perspective, I think in addition to the excellent comments made, I think quality is also, to me, a topic around sustainability, right? What we talked about today was a lot around efficiencies, and how can we gain these efficiencies, and how do we think about these topics both critically and from the perspective of the patients, and how the patients may be impacted, how the sites or HCPs, right, the ecosystem that they're treated in, how that may also be impacted, and where we can make the connection to really be holistic and really think universally about these diseases that we're treating.
I have two minds on this one. If it's real world data quality to support internal decision making, I think we're there. I think it's fairly mature. I think people are aware of the limitations, and we can currently use it to make really important internal decisions. If it's to convince a regulator to approve a product, I'd say we're not in infancy, but maybe, childhood. There have been successful cases in certain therapeutic areas. I don't think it's quite ready we're not in prime time. So I think there's a lot of room for growth when it comes to supporting those regulatory decisions.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks all. And on that note, just want to thank all the attendees for coming to listen to us. I think it was a really great discussion. Wishing you a good rest of day and festive season. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.